I'm Raymond Auerbach. I'm Professor of Soil Science and Plant Production at the Nelson Mandela University's George campus. I've been farming organically for 45 years and training farmers for 20 years, and then working in research and policy work for the last 10 years or so. And I'm passionate about soil and about organic farming, about helping small-scale farmers around Africa to feed themselves, and I believe this can best be done with organic farming. So organic farming has been an important part of my life since I was a youngster, because when I traveled around rural South Africa in the 60s, one saw rural poverty as a major part of the reality of most South Africans, and one saw attempts to introduce agricultural technology, and it basically didn't work in Africa because the supply chains aren't there to supply the inputs which are needed by the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution got going in Africa in the 70s and basically was a massive failure in Africa, precisely because to use Green Revolution technology, you need the fertilizer, you need the poisons, you need the irrigation, you need the seed technology, and you need the mechanization to be able to do larger areas of land. Now, mechanization is not a problem. I think all of us realize that it's hard work farming, and that if you can have a tractor to help you, that's only a good thing. But the other four are problematic: to get the water into the right place, to get the chemicals without damage to human health and the environment, to use agricultural fertilizers which are synthetic, which get into the groundwater, which get into the rivers, and the whole package has to be there, otherwise it doesn't work. So we saw in Asia and in South America that the Green Revolution did help the big farmers to increase their yields, but it helped a lot of small-scale farmers to wind up on the pavements in Calcutta because they simply couldn't make the whole package work, and mostly because they didn't have water. And that is why the Green Revolution failed in Africa, that there was a lot of work on breeding rice, but maize is the staple food in Africa, and we didn't have the same amount of water available as the Asians and the South Americans did. So if you don't have irrigation, you are going to encounter really big risks by borrowing money to have fertilizer and poisons and hybrid seeds. So I started working with organic farming. I went and did an apprenticeship first in the Cape at Hermanus, and then for 4 years in Australia. I did a lot of dairy science and a lot of soil science in Australia, and I saw how large-scale farmers were using organic and biodynamic farming systems to allow them to increase production without wrecking the environment. And I was then committed. So when I came back in 1976, I went and did my South African apprenticeship in participatory development with Baba Robert Mazibuko, who was the African tree man in Pietermaritzburg. And Mazibuko taught me about working with people, starting where they were, helping them to use the resources they have, and helping them to build systematically so that they could actually have a livelihood out of agriculture, where a lot of that was in our tradition and culture many years ago, but thanks to apartheid, much of that knowledge was lost, and a lot of it had to be rebuilt in terms of farming systems that were sustainable, that were based on traditional knowledge systems, but were also using scientific research from the 90s and this millennium to understand how ecological agriculture could really make things work without screwing up the environment. So essentially, I became passionate about organic agriculture, but I had met with Peace Corps people who were very much do-gooders and very much coming to Africa to help the poor Africans. And having met a couple of really arrogant outsiders, I made a promise to myself that I'm not going to try to teach other people to do something that I haven't actually done myself. So I went into farming, organic farming, and I farmed organically for about 20 years on 3 different farms, mostly in Kokstad on a small dairy farm, and then later closer to Durban, where I had a small coffee farm and just milked 3 cows. And I set this up as a little 8-hectare model farm, saying, if you've got 8 hectares, you can employ a few people and you can make money out of agriculture. And I showed that that was possible. We didn't make a lot of money, but we made money out of agriculture, enough to pay the people who were helping me good wages and to have my family grow up with a lifestyle that I thought was appropriate for youngsters to build a relationship with the soil. So after farming on this particular farm for about 10 years, we set up on the farm the Rainman Landcare Foundation, and we started training farmers. And for the next 15 years, we trained farmers in South and Eastern Africa, and we had a lot of experience where the farmers were actually able to get skills that really assisted them in production and in coming together and forming cooperatives, forming quality management systems, which allowed them to get group certification as organic farmers. So after about another 10 years of training farmers, we then decided that we needed to get the tools of science, and I did my master's and then my doctorate, and the doctorate looked at integrated catchment management in the Mlazi River catchment, and we worked with small-scale farmers, with craft people, and with school environmental education clubs, and we were able to get people up and down the Mlazi River working together to look after the environment while producing food, which they were able to sell at a good price. So that was really my first major experience with getting participatory rural appraisal going, developing participatory guarantee systems with the communities, which is a way of saying if it's organic enough for my customers, it's organic enough, and I don't need an outside expensive third-party certification. So these two tools, participatory rural appraisal, a set of tools that help outsiders to understand the community's problems and help the community itself to understand its own problems and to plan for the future. That was one tool, and participatory guarantee systems were another tool that really allow farmers to change their terms of trade, to enter high-end markets while not having to pay huge amounts on certification. And at that point then, I met Julian May. I'd known him in KwaZulu-Natal, but I moved down to Nelson Mandela University and became an associate professor of plant production and soil science there. And Julian and I discussed what we could do with the Center of Excellence for Food Security. We helped with the original proposal. And when eventually the proposal was successful, I started my long-term trials comparing organic and conventional agriculture on the George campus of the Nelson Mandela University. And those trials have been going for 4 years now, and they have been really important in showing the first evidence in Southern Africa that, in fact, organic farming can yield similar levels to conventional farming. So when we look at low external input sustainable agriculture, we used to talk about low input sustainable agriculture, and then 30 years ago we began to realize it's not low input, it's low external input, because there is a considerable input of management. And so you have to learn how to manage soils, you have to learn how to manage crops if you want to do things organically or using agroecological principles. But the great thing is that if you have learned how to farm, you can do it with minimal external inputs. And all over Africa we find that because the infrastructure is not great, the roads are not great, the availability of technology is not great, if you can learn how to farm and then use the resources that you have to make compost, to improve your soil, and then to be able to plow, you need some mechanization, but to be able to plow and plant with a crop rotation, using compost, using mulches, then you can close that yield gap reasonably well. So the Mandela trials that we set up in 2014 essentially looked at giving low amounts of compost just to every third crop. So we have a rotation of cabbage, which is a heavy feeder crop, needs a lot of nutrition. We give it 5 tons per hectare of compost, which is not a very heavy dressing. Then we follow with sweet potato, which is a light feeder, which doesn't need so much nutrient, and it gets no compost at all because there has to be enough from the previous crop to carry forward. And then we follow with cowpea, which is an African legume that is one of the biggest fixers of nitrogen, and it is eaten very commonly in northern parts of South Africa and Malawi and those areas. It is a wonderful crop that is very robust and is able to fix more nitrogen than almost any other crop in the world. So this rotation of the heavy feeder cabbage, which gets a bit of compost, the light feeder sweet potato, which doesn't get any nutrient at all in the organic treatment, and the cowpea, which brings nitrogen into the soil, is the minimum kind of rotation that you need: heavy feeder, light feeder, legume, and the organic with only fertilizer once every third crop, the conventional getting fertilizer for every single crop, and the cabbage getting about 4 times the level of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that the organic gets, and then obviously still getting nutrients for the sweet potato and cowpea from fertilizer, and getting all the chemical sprays that are necessary to deal with whatever pests and diseases might arise, whereas the organic system only gets the biological controls that are available. So we were able to control pests and diseases really well. We found there were more pests and diseases in the conventional trials than in the organic, even though they were adjacent plots. And we were, in the first year, found that we had a 20% yield gap. And the 20% yield gap, the organic was yielding 20% less than the conventional, which is what we expected. In the second year, we thought we might close the gap slightly, but it in fact got bigger. We had 31% less yield for the organic than the conventional. And when we looked at our soils, we realized that the improvements to soil available phosphorus that we had done were not sufficient and hadn't worked well enough on the soils. So we had to supplement with some rock phosphate. And once we supplemented with rock phosphate and lifted the soil available phosphate levels, we managed to close the yield gap. So in the third year, in fact, the organic cabbage out-yielded the conventional, not by a big amount, by about 5%, but it was a very dry year. And what was also interesting is that the water use efficiency of organic systems is better than conventional. Partly we put mulch on and the mulch reduces evaporation, but partly we build the soil organic matter levels through the compost that is provided, and the soil organic matter holds nutrients and holds the water in the soil. So whereas the soil surface levels in a typical test of the organic were about 21%, the soil surface moisture levels in conventional under the same conditions were around about 14%. So a significant improvement in water holding capacity. We also found that the soils got sweeter. We were able to reduce acidity, and in the eastern seaboard of Africa, we find that a big problem is exchangeable aluminium in acid soils. The aluminium grabs hold of the phosphate, and the phosphate is not available for the plants. But as the organic sweetens up the soil, the exchangeable aluminium levels drop and the available phosphorus becomes greater. So providing that you are supplying enough phosphorus to meet the needs of the crops, over time you will eventually sweeten up the soil, and the trials showed after the 4th year that there had been considerable sweetening of the soil, less exchangeable aluminium in the organic plots, and the available soil phosphate wasn't really great in either of the plots, on conventional or organic, but it was enough to be adequate for the plant's needs. So we found after 4 years we can say that we have a sustainable organic system which is yielding similar levels to the conventional system. But in the 4th year, it was a wet year, the conventional again out-yielded organic, but also by a small percentage. So we can say that both systems work, but the organic will tend to work better in a dry year, the conventional will tend to work better in a wet year, and given climate change, we're likely to see more and more dry years. So we feel that for conditions under climate change, and because of the fact that African farmers cannot easily access inputs of synthetic fertilizer and chemicals, and also for health reasons, organic farming systems are much more desirable for Africa than conventional ones.